Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Best of American Heritage, The Civil War. Edited by Edwin S. Grosvenor. Read by Sean Pratt. Prologue. For some Americans, the Civil War may seem like ancient history, a jumble of half-remembered events: the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and his assassination by John Wilkes Booth. But the Civil War was an enormous and profound event that challenged the very existence of the United States. The attempt of Southern slave states to secede from the Union, coming only 2 generations after the nation's founding, posed a critical test of the United States' character, endurance, and will to survive. Oliver Jensen, one of American Heritage's editors, wrote that the Civil War is America's most monumental drama and morality tale. And within that larger drama were innumerable first-hand stories of courage, cunning, and loss. Civil War armies were the most literate that ever fought a war up to that time, writes historian James McPherson, while 20th century armies censored soldiers' mail and discouraged diary-keeping. Thus we have an unparalleled view of the Civil War by the people who experienced it. Lincoln saw the Civil War as God's punishment of North and South alike for the sin of slavery. If that were so, the penalty was severe. More than 600,000 Americans lost their lives. Millions were maimed or had their property stolen or destroyed. Atlanta, Charleston, Columbia, and Richmond, along with countless small towns, were left in ruins. So it's not surprising that given its outsized importance in our nation's history, the Civil War has always occupied an important place in the pages of American heritage. One of the most acclaimed historians of the war, Bruce Catton, was the magazine's founding editor. Catton attracted many other writers who also had insights and details to share about the Civil War. As Catton's term as editor neared its end, David McCullough joined the staff. McCullough's talent is evident in this volume's wonderful portrait of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the creation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Stowe's novel appeared in 1852, only a small minority of the country opposed slavery, despite years of debate over the fugitive slave laws and the moral arguments of abolitionists. Stowe's book changed the way the country thought and talked about slavery. In it, she humanized the plight of slaves. Within a year of publication, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more than 500,000 copies. Although Stowe wasn't a crusader, she had written the Abolitionists' Manifesto, wrote McCullough. Senator Charles Sumner, and many others, credited the book with rousing the public to action and bringing about the election of Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass praised the novel as a flash to light 1,000,000 campfires in front of the embattled hosts of slavery. Lincoln reportedly remarked that, "This is the little woman who started the war," when Stowe visited the White House a few years later. Ever since the Civil War, observers have wondered if better political leadership could have averted the bloodshed and destruction, and whether slavery would have collapsed on its own. In another chapter, Columbia University historian Allen Nevins argues that the succession of 3 weak presidents between 1850 and 1861, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, who one contemporary called the damnedest old fool that has ever occupied the presidential chair, could have contributed to the advent of war. Could stronger and cannier leaders have somehow avoided the debacle? The greatest mistake a nation can make, Nevins warns, is to put at its helm an unprincipled man, so pliable that he will palter with a clean-cut and momentous issue. Certainly, one event that sped the nation's movement to war was John Brown's extraordinary attack on Harper's Ferry. In this volume, Thomas Fleming tells the story of the raid, the flawed trial that followed, and the hanging of the raiders. Fleming describes how, on October 16, 1859, Brown and 21 armed followers seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and converted it into a fortress. Brown believed that slaves in the surrounding area would run away from their owners to join his group. Then he would declare his own Virginia government and lead a force of blacks and whites into the South, freeing more slaves along the way. But, fearful of brutal reprisal from their owners, slaves failed to turn up at Harper's Ferry, and the next day a Virginia militia drove Brown and his band out of the arsenal and into the adjacent fire engine house. A firefight raged for a day and a half until all but 7 of the raiders were killed, captured, or had fled. Their exploits, as well as those of less revered military leaders, are brought alive in this book. Included here is Stephen Sears's detailed and balanced portrait of Robert E. Lee. Sears writes that when a general asked one of Jefferson Davis's aides if he thought Lee had the ability to lead an army, he replied that Lee is audacity personified. His name is audacity. Sears also paints a very different but equally powerful portrait of George B. McClellan, whose reluctance to engage in battle arguably prolonged the war for years and cost countless lives. McClellan seemed to be a strong, decisive commander, a general with an unmatched gift for organizing and motivating his troops, observes Sears, but in battle he was all but paralyzed by a loss of will and a fear of defeat. Another lesser-known general, George Henry Thomas, gets his due in this book. Peter Andrews describes how Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and the strategist behind Northern victories in the Western Theater, was crucial to the Union's success. In Antietam, Bruce Catton describes in vivid detail the fateful day in September 1862, the bloodiest day in American history, when the war turned in favor of the North. In the entirety of the American Civil War, no single day was bloodier or more costly than that one day on the hills and fields overlooking Antietam Creek in western Maryland. A total of 22,717 lives were lost on this day. The chapters ahead are filled with vivid, sometimes quirky accounts of lesser-known characters, including the story of Belle Boyd, the glamorous Southern spy, and war correspondent G.W. Smalley. One chapter describes the miraculously speedy construction of the North's ironclad warship, the USS Monitor, just in time to defeat the Confederate CSS Virginia and prevent Britain from siding with the South. Another illuminates the horrors of prison camps on both sides, highlighting the infamous Andersonville in Georgia. R.N. Curran tells us of the debate, even as the war's slaughter continued, over Lincoln's plan to rebuild the shattered nation, evoking another question. Could a leader different from Andrew Johnson have prevented the worst excesses of Reconstruction? The end of the war prompted the greatest parade in the nation's history, with the North's 2 victorious armies marching through Washington to the tireless cheers of its grateful citizens. Before that, however, came the tragedy that would shape the country's course for a century to come: the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, reported in detail here by historian Philip B. Kunhart, Jr. The Civil War tested us as a nation like no other moment in our history, and the stories of heroism, folly, and suffering make for fascinating reading. Edwin S. Grosvenor. Introduction. Americans just can't get enough of the Civil War, says Terry Winchell, historian of the Vicksburg National Military Park. Millions of visitors come to Vicksburg every year. Tens of thousands of Civil War reenactors spend hundreds of dollars on replica weapons, uniforms, and equipment. Many travel long distances to help restage Civil War battles. Another 250,000 Americans describe themselves as Civil War buffs or hobbyists. As a beneficiary of this popular interest in the Civil War, I am often asked to explain what accounts for it, in particular to explain my contribution to the literature on the war and its causes. Battle Cry of Freedom was on national bestseller lists for several months as a hardcover book in 1988 and again as a paperback in 1989. First, the human cost of the Civil War was by far the most devastating in America's history. The 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers who lost their lives almost equaled the 680,000 American soldiers who died in all the other wars this country has fought combined. When we add the unknown but probably substantial number of civilian deaths, from disease, malnutrition, exposure, or injury, among the hundreds of thousands of refugees in the Confederacy, the toll of Civil War dead may exceed war deaths in all the rest of American history. Consider the Battle of Antietam, America's single bloodiest day. The 25,000 casualties there were nearly 4 times the number of American casualties on D-Day. The 6,500 men killed in one day near Sharpsburg were nearly double the number of Americans killed in combat in all the rest of the country's 19th century wars combined. As Thomas Hardy once put it, war makes rattling good history, but peace is poor reading. The sound of drum and trumpet, the call to arms, the clash of armies have stirred the blood of nations throughout history. As the horrors and the seamy side of war recede into the past, the romance and honor and glory forge into the foreground. Of no war has this been truer than of the Civil War. William Faulkner said the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. As any reader of Faulkner's novels knows, the Civil War is central to that past that is present. It is the watershed of American Southern history. It is, as Mark Twain put it a century ago, after a tour through the South, what A.D. is elsewhere. They date from it. The symbols of that past and present surround Southerners as they grow up. From the Robert E. Lee Elementary School or Jefferson Davis High School they attend, to the Confederate soldier enshrined in bronze or granite in their town square. Some of those symbols remain controversial and provoke as much passion today as in 1863. The song Dixie, for example, and the Confederate flag, which for many Southern whites continues to represent courage, honor, and defiance, while to blacks they represent racism and oppression. This suggests the most important reason for the enduring fascination with the Civil War. Great issues were at stake. Issues about which Americans were willing to fight and die. Issues whose resolution transformed and redefined the United States. The Civil War was fought mainly by volunteer soldiers. The Union and Confederate armies mobilized as volunteers a larger percentage of their society's manpower than any other war in American history, probably in world history. Most of the volunteers knew what they were fighting for and why. What were they fighting for? If asked to define it in a single word, many soldiers on both sides would have answered, liberty. They fought for the heritage of freedom bequeathed to them by the Founding Fathers. North and South alike wrapped themselves in the mantle of 1776. But the two sides interpreted that heritage in opposite ways. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860 on a platform of excluding slavery from the territories, Southerners compared him to George III and declared their independence from oppressive Yankee rule. The same spirit of freedom and independence that impelled our fathers to the separation from the British government, proclaimed secessionists, would impel the liberty-loving people of the South to separation from the United States. One Georgia secessionist declared that Southerners would be either slaves in the Union or free men out of it. Men from Texas to Virginia rushed to enlist in this holy cause of liberty and independence, and to raise the standard of liberty and equality for white men against our abolition enemies who are pledged to prostrate the white freemen of the South down to equality with Negroes. From the high and solemn motive of defending and protecting the rights which our fathers bequeathed to us, declared Jefferson Davis at the outset of war, let us renew such sacrifices as our fathers made to the holy cause of constitutional liberty. But most Northerners ridiculed Southern professions to be fighting for the ideals of the American Revolution. That was a libel upon the whole character and conduct of the men of '76, said the anti-slavery poet and journalist William Cullen Bryant. The Founding Fathers, he argued, had fought to establish the rights of man and principles of universal liberty. The South, insisted Bryant, had seceded not in the interest of general humanity, but of a domestic despotism. Their motto is not liberty, but slavery. Northerners did not deny the right of revolution in principle. After all, the United States was founded on that right. But the right of revolution, wrote Lincoln in 1861, is never a legal right. At most, it is but a moral right, when exercised for a morally justifiable cause. When exercised without such a cause, revolution is no right, but simply a wicked exercise of physical power. In Lincoln's judgment, secession was just such a wicked exercise. The event that precipitated it was Lincoln's election by a constitutional majority. As Northerners saw it, the Southern states, having controlled the country's government for the previous 2 generations, decided to leave the Union because they lost an election. For Lincoln and the Northern people, it was the Union that represented the ideals of 1776. They believed that the republic established by the Founding Fathers was a fragile experiment in a world bestridden by kings, emperors, czars, and dictators. Most republics through history had eventually been overthrown. Republics in Latin America came and went with bewildering rapidity. The United States in 1861 represented, in Lincoln's words, the last, best hope for the survival of Republican liberties in the world. Our popular government has often been called an experiment, Lincoln told Congress on July 4, 1861. But if the Confederacy succeeded in splitting the country, it would destroy the experiment. The central idea pervading this struggle, said Lincoln, is the necessity of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether, in a free government, the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. Many soldiers who enlisted in the Union Army felt the same way. A Missourian joined up as, "A duty I owe my country and to my children to do what I can to preserve this government, as I shudder to think what is ahead of them if this government should be overthrown." A New England soldier wrote to his wife, "I know how great a debt we owe to those who went before us, through the blood and sufferings of the Revolution, and I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life, to help maintain this government, and to pay that debt." Freedom for the slaves was not part of the liberty for which the North fought in 1861. That was not because the Lincoln administration supported slavery. Quite the contrary. Slavery was an unqualified evil to the Negro, to the white man, and to the state, said Lincoln on many occasions in words that expressed the sentiments of a Northern majority. The monstrous injustice of slavery deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions, with plausibility, to taunt us as hypocrites. Yet in his first inaugural address, Lincoln declared that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists. Lincoln was bound by a constitution that protected slavery in any state where citizens wanted it. The Republic of Liberty, for whose preservation the North was fighting, had been a republic in which slavery was legal everywhere in 1776. That was the great American paradox, a land of freedom based on slavery. Even in 1861, 4 states that remained loyal to the Union were slave states, and the Democratic minority in free states opposed any move to make the war for the Union a war against slavery. But as the war went on, slaves took the first step toward making it a war against their plight. Coming into Union lines by the thousands, they voted with their feet for freedom. As enemy property, they could be confiscated by Union forces as contraband of war. This was the thin edge of the wedge that finally broke the American paradox. By 1863, a series of congressional acts, plus Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, enlarged Union war aims. The North fought not just to ensure that the nation born in 1776 shall not perish from the earth, but to give that nation a new birth of freedom. Northern victory in the Civil War resolved 2 fundamental issues left unresolved by the Revolution: whether this fragile Republican experiment, called the United States, would survive, and whether the House divided would continue to endure, half slave and half free. Many doubted the Republic's survival. Many European conservatives predicted its demise. Some Americans advocated the right of secession and periodically threatened to invoke it. 11 states did invoke it in 1860 and 1861. But since 1865, No state or region has threatened secession, not even during the massive resistance to desegregation from 1954 to 1964. Before 1865, the United States was the largest slaveholding country in the world. In the process of preserving the Union, the Civil War also transformed it. Before 1861, the words United States were a plural noun. For example, the United States are a large country. Since 1865, United States has been a singular noun. The North went to war to preserve the Union. It created a nation. This transformation can be traced to Lincoln's wartime addresses. His first inaugural address contained the word Union 20 times, and the word nation not once. In Lincoln's first message to Congress on July 4, 1864, he said Union 49 times and nation only 3 times. In his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley concerning slavery and the war, Lincoln spoke of the Union 9 times and the nation not at all. But in the Gettysburg Address, 15 months later, he did not refer to the Union at all, but used the word nation 5 times. And in the second inaugural address, Lincoln spoke of one side seeking to dissolve the Union and the other side's accepting the challenge of war to preserve the nation. The decentralized republic, in which the post office was the only agency of national government that touched the average citizen, was transformed by the crucible of war into a centralized polity that taxed people directly and created an internal revenue bureau to collect the taxes, expanded the jurisdiction of federal courts, created a national currency and a federally chartered banking system, and drafted men into the army. From 1789 to 1861, a Southern slaveholder was President of the United States 2/3 of the time, and 2/3 of the Speakers of the House and Presidents pro tem of the Senate had also been Southerners. 20 of the 35 Supreme Court justices during that period were from the South. A century passed before another resident of a Southern state was elected president. For half a century after the war, hardly any Southerners served as Speaker of the House or President pro tem of the Senate, and only 9 of the 30 Supreme Court justices appointed during that half-century were Southerners. For better or for worse, the flames of Civil War forged the framework of modern America. James M. McPherson. Chapter 1. The Little Woman Who Made This Big War, by David McCullough. Harriet Beecher Stowe was brought up to make herself useful, and it suited her. As a child, she was known as Hattie. She was cheerful but shy, prone to fantasies, playful and pretty. Years later, she described herself differently. To begin, then, I am a little bit of a woman, somewhat more than 40, about as thin and dry as a pinch of snuff, never very much to look at in my best days, and looking like a used-up article now. She wasn't altogether serious, but the description was one people remembered. It was in striking contrast to the huge reputation she gained when her Uncle Tom's Cabin swept the nation, bolstering the abolitionist cause and pitting North against South. Meeting her for the first time, Abraham Lincoln looked down from his 6'4" height and said, "So, this is the little woman who made this big war." It was only a minor exaggeration. She was born in Litchfield, Connecticut in 1811, when Lincoln was 2 years old, and Dolly Madison was in the White House. She was the 7th of 9 children of Roxana Foote and Lyman Beecher. Hattie was such a good worker, even when small, that her preacher father liked to say he would gladly have given $100 if she could have been born a boy. When Hattie was young, she found most of her father's Calvinist sermons about as intelligible as the Choctaw language, she wrote later, and never was at peace with his religion. She still loved him, though, and for all his gloomy talk of sin and damnation, it is not hard to understand why. He was a powerful, assertive figure who had an almost fiendish zest for life, for hunting and fishing with his sons, listening to music and playing the violin, which he did, badly. If he could only play what he heard inside his head, he told them all, He could be another Paganini. Best of all, he loved to snare souls. Lyman Beecher needed to use all his tremendous energy. He kept a pile of sand in his cellar, and if his day was not enough to use him up or stormy weather kept him from outdoor exercise, down the stairs he would go to shovel sand. On Sunday mornings, Lyman would bound along through the sunshine, late again for that appointed hour, when, weekly, he brought down Calvinist thunder upon the heads of upright Litchfield people. He reserved a special wrath for drunkards and Unitarians, and he believed passionately in the second coming, although something made him shy away from the strictest tenet of his creed, total predestination and its logic. Once, when he agreed to exchange pulpits with another pastor, he was told that the arrangement had been preordained. "Is that so?" he said. "Then I won't do it." And he didn't. The happiest times in her childhood, Hattie wrote later, were days spent away from her father, visiting her Aunt Harriet in Nut Plains, Connecticut. Her aunt's house was filled with books and pictures gathered by a seafaring uncle and a wonderful old Tory grandmother, who in private still said Episcopal prayers for the king and queen. At 12, Hattie was a bit of a romantic. She often wandered off from the noisy parsonage to lie on a green hillside, gaze into the sky, and dream of Lord Byron, the English poet. One month she read Ivanhoe 7 times. In 1832, when Hattie turned 21, Lyman Beecher answered the call to become the first president of the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. He picked up his family and set off for what he called the majestic West. He envisioned a New Jerusalem established on the banks of the Ohio River. The family spirits were lifted, and crossing the Allegheny Mountains they sang Jubilee. A Philadelphia journal likened the exodus of the Reverend Mr. Beecher and his family to the migration of Jacob and his sons. The following summer, the man who was hired as Lane Theological Seminary's first professor, biblical scholar Calvin Ellis Stowe, traveled west in the Beecher's wake. Accompanying him was his bride, Eliza, who became Hattie's best friend in Cincinnati, but died shortly after her arrival. Apparently, shared grief over Eliza brought Hattie and Stowe together. Years later, with some of the proceeds from Uncle Tom's Cabin, they commissioned an artist to paint a portrait of Eliza, and every year after that, on Eliza's birthday, the two of them sat before the painting and reminisced about her. Calvin and Hattie's wedding took place in early January 1836. The night before the ceremony, trying to describe her emotions in a letter to a school friend, 24-year-old Hattie confessed she felt nothing at all. Calvin was 23, but he seemed as old as her father. He was fluent in French, German, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian. He was an authority on education. He knew the Bible better than her father did. He was said to have a grand sense of humor, but he was fat, forgetful, and fussy. In the midst of a crisis, Hattie discovered, he tended to take to his bed, demonstrating absolutely no faculty, that Yankee virtue she defined as being the opposite of shiftlessness. Calvin also had an eye for pretty women and a taste for spirits, but these proclivities, it seems, never got him into any particular trouble. There was more. Calvin maintained that he was haunted by phantoms. They visited him most any time, but favored dusk. They appeared quite effortlessly out of the woodwork, the floor, or the furniture. There was a regular cast of characters, Calvin said, as real and familiar to him as anyone else he knew, including a giant Indian woman and a dwarf who, between them, carried a huge bass fiddle. There was a troop of Puritans from his native Natick in Massachusetts, shadowy and dark blue in color, and one very pleasant-looking human face he called Harvey. They performed music for Calvin Stowe, and somehow or other they talked to him without making any sound at all, or so he said. He had no reluctance to discuss the subject, and there is no indication that any of his circle thought less of him for it. The Stowe's marriage proved difficult from its start. Hattie became pregnant about the same time the state of Ohio requested that Calvin go to Prussia to study educational systems there. Professing a profound fear of sea travel, Calvin told Hattie he would never see her again in this life. She insisted he go anyway, and bore their twin daughters while he was gone. Calvin returned to Cincinnati after some months.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?